My name is Amanda, and I learned that some people's opinions of you say more about them than about you when my mother-in-law decided I was worthless based on her outdated expectations of marriage. I met David in law school where we were both struggling through our third year. He was kind, intelligent, and refreshingly different from the competitive sharks that populated most of our classes. We studied together, supported each other through the bar exam, and fell in love somewhere between constitutional law and criminal procedure. David went into family law, opening a small practice that helped ordinary people navigate divorce, custody, and adoption. I chose a different path, criminal defense, specializing in white-collar crime and federal cases. It was demanding, high-stakes work that required long hours and complete dedication. When David proposed, I thought I was gaining not just a husband but a supportive family. I was wrong about the family part. Margaret Chin, David's mother, made her disapproval clear from our first meeting. She was a traditional woman who believed wives should prioritize home and family above all else. The fact that I worked long hours, traveled for cases, and sometimes missed family dinners was, in her view, evidence of my failure as a woman. "My son deserves better than you," became her standard greeting at family gatherings. She'd say it with a smile, as if it were a friendly observation rather than a cruel judgment. "You're useless as a wife," she'd add, usually while I was helping clean up after dinner or trying to contribute to family conversations. David would half-heartedly defend me. "Mom, Amanda works hard. She's very successful." Successful at what? Neglecting her husband? A wife's job is to support her family, not chase some career fantasy. What Margaret didn't know was exactly how successful I was. While she assumed I was just another struggling lawyer, I'd actually built a reputation as one of the top criminal defense attorneys in the state. My clients included Fortune 500 executives, politicians, and anyone facing serious federal charges who could afford the best representation. I kept my professional achievements private, partly because David preferred not to discuss the details of my more controversial cases, and partly because I'd learned that some people react negatively to successful women. Margaret's attitude seemed to confirm that instinct. At family dinners, Margaret would regale us with stories of her friends' daughters-in-law who were proper wives, women who cooked elaborate meals, maintained perfect homes, and devoted themselves entirely to their husband's happiness. "Linda's daughter-in-law makes fresh bread every day," she'd say, glancing pointedly at the store-bought rolls on our table. "And Jennifer's girl quit her job the moment she got married. She understands priorities." I'd smile politely and change the subject, while David squirmed uncomfortably in his chair. The criticism extended beyond domestic skills. Margaret questioned my appearance, my cooking, my failure to produce grandchildren, and my general worthiness as a member of the Chin family. "When I was your age, I had already given my husband 2 sons and kept a beautiful home," she'd say. Women today just don't understand what marriage means. During holiday celebrations, she'd introduce me to other family members as David's wife, the one who's never home. She'd then spend the evening highlighting my shortcomings while praising the domestic goddesses married to David's cousins. The worst incident happened at David's birthday party last year. Margaret had invited several family friends, including a young woman named Susan who was recently divorced. "Susan is such a good cook," Margaret announced loudly enough for everyone to hear. "And she's looking for a nice man to take care of. David, you remember Susan from high school, don't you?" David's face turned red with embarrassment. "Mom, I'm married." "Yes, but marriages aren't always permanent," Margaret replied with a meaningful look at me. "Sometimes people realize they made mistakes." I excused myself to the bathroom, where I stood in front of the mirror taking deep breaths and reminding myself that Margaret's opinion didn't define my worth or my marriage. What Margaret also didn't know was that her own life wasn't as perfect as she pretended. My work in white-collar crime had taught me to recognize certain patterns, and I'd noticed some concerning details about Margaret's finances. She lived in an expensive house, drove a luxury car, and frequently took elaborate vacations, all on a modest widow's pension. She claimed to be an astute investor, but her explanations of her income sources were vague and inconsistent. More troubling were the tax documents I'd accidentally seen when helping David organize some family papers. Margaret's reported income didn't match her lifestyle, and there were irregularities that would have made any experienced attorney suspicious. I never said anything to David about my concerns. It wasn't my place to investigate my mother-in-law's finances, and I hoped I was wrong about what those red flags might indicate. But 6 months ago, my suspicions were confirmed in the most dramatic way possible. I was in my office preparing for a high-profile embezzlement trial when my secretary buzzed me. "Amanda, there's a Margaret Chin on line 1. She says it's urgent and she needs the best criminal defense attorney in the city." My blood ran cold. Margaret was calling me for legal help, which meant she was in serious trouble. She had no idea she was talking to her supposedly useless daughter-in-law. "Tell her I'll call back in 5 minutes, I said, needing time to process this development. When I returned the call, Margaret's voice was shaky with panic. "I need help immediately. The IRS has arrested me for tax fraud. They're saying I owe hundreds of thousands in back taxes and penalties. I need the best lawyer money can buy." "Ma'am, can you tell me more about the charges?" "They claim I've been underreporting income for 8 years. They have bank records, they have documentation. I don't know what to do." I closed my eyes, knowing this conversation was about to get very complicated. "Mrs. Chin, I'll need to review the case details before taking you on as a client. Can you meet me at the Federal Detention Center?" "Yes, anything. They said I might go to prison for 20 years. Please, I'll pay whatever you charge. I'll be there in an hour." As I gathered my briefcase and legal files, I realized that Margaret was about to discover exactly how useless her daughter-in-law really was. The woman who had spent years dismissing my career was about to learn that her freedom depended on the skills she'd been mocking. I drove to the detention center knowing that this case would change everything between us. Margaret was facing serious federal charges, and I was quite possibly the only attorney with both the expertise and the availability to save her from prison. The irony wasn't lost on me. The woman who constantly told me I was a failure as a wife was about to find out that I was exactly the kind of successful professional she claimed to despise. But more than irony, I felt the weight of professional responsibility. Regardless of Margaret's treatment of me, she was entitled to competent legal representation. And despite our personal history, I was arguably the best person to provide it. I parked outside the federal building, adjusted my suit jacket, and prepared to walk into what would undoubtedly be the most awkward attorney-client meeting of my career. Margaret was waiting in interrogation room 3, probably expecting to meet some high-powered male attorney who fit her image of what success looked like. Instead, she was about to see her useless daughter-in-law walk through that door carrying the legal expertise that might be her only hope of avoiding prison. I took a deep breath and pushed open the door to interrogation room 3. Margaret sat at a metal table, her usually perfect appearance disheveled. Her hands were shaking as she clutched a tissue, and her designer dress was wrinkled from hours in custody. She looked up expectantly as I entered, then her face went through a series of expressions: confusion, recognition, and finally, complete shock. "Amanda," she whispered. "What are you doing here?" I set my briefcase on the table and pulled out my business card, sliding it across to her. "I'm here as your attorney, Mrs. Chin." She stared at the card. "Amanda Chin, JD Criminal Defense Attorney, Federal Cases Specialist." "This is impossible. You work at some small law firm." "I'm a partner at Morrison, Blake & Associates. We handle high-profile federal criminal defense cases." I opened my briefcase and pulled out her file. "Now let's discuss your situation." Margaret continued staring at me like I'd transformed into someone completely different. "You're the best defense attorney in the city?" "According to several legal publications, yes. But you're never home. You miss family dinners. You don't cook." "Because I'm working cases that determine whether people spend decades in prison or walk free." She fell silent, still processing this revelation. "Mrs. Chin, we need to focus on your case. The IRS has charged you with willful tax evasion, filing false returns, and money laundering. You're facing up to 20 years in federal prison." Her face went pale. 20 years. I reviewed the documents the prosecutor had provided. They have 8 years of financial records showing unreported income totaling $1.2 million. They also have evidence of money being moved through multiple accounts to hide assets. I didn't know it was illegal. "Margaret." I used her first name for the first time in our relationship. "As your attorney, I need complete honesty. How did you acquire this unreported income?" She looked down at her hands. "After Harold died, I was struggling financially. A friend introduced me to someone who needed help with his business. Cash transactions, nothing complicated." "What kind of business?" Import, export. He paid me to receive packages and forward them to other addresses. Sometimes I'd deposit money into my account and write checks to people on a list. I closed my eyes. Money laundering and potentially trafficking. This was worse than simple tax evasion. How much were you paid for these services? About $15,000 per month. For 8 years. Over $1 million. Margaret had been operating as a money launderer for nearly a decade while lecturing me about being a proper wife. Margaret, you were participating in a money laundering operation. The unreported income is just one part of this. He started crying. I didn't know. I thought it was just business help. Did you ever ask why someone would pay you $180,000 per year to forward packages? Silence. I spent the next hour reviewing evidence with her. The case was solid. The government had bank records, surveillance footage, and testimony from other participants in the scheme who had already pled guilty. What are my options? She asked finally. Option 1. Plead guilty and cooperate fully. With your cooperation, I might negotiate a sentence of 5 to 7 years. Prison. I can't go to prison. Option 2. Go to trial. But Margaret, the evidence against you is overwhelming. If convicted at trial, you'd face the full 20 years. She broke down completely. Please, Amanda. I know I've been terrible to you, but please help me. I am helping you. I'm giving you the best legal advice possible. But there has to be something else. Some way to avoid prison entirely. I lean back in my chair. There might be. If you can provide substantial assistance in prosecuting the people who organized this operation. What kind of assistance? Names, locations, methods of operation. If you can help them dismantle the entire network, the prosecutor might consider house arrest and probation. I can do that. I kept records of everything: names, addresses, bank account numbers. For the first time since walking into the room, I felt hopeful about her case. Over the next 3 weeks, I negotiated with federal prosecutors while Margaret provided detailed information about the money laundering operation. Her cooperation led to arrests of 12 people, including the organizers. The prosecutor was impressed. Your client's information was invaluable. We're willing to recommend 18 months house arrest followed by 3 years probation. No prison time. Margaret would keep her freedom and her house, though she'd have to pay substantial fines and back taxes. When I delivered the news, Margaret broke down crying again, but this time from relief. Amanda, I don't know how to thank you. You can start by treating me with respect. She nodded emphatically. I will. I promise. And maybe acknowledging that my career isn't a hobby or a character flaw. I had no idea what you actually do. All those times you missed dinner. I was preparing cases, researching precedents, working to keep people out of prison. Just like I did for you. The sentencing hearing was held on a Tuesday morning. I presented Margaret's cooperation agreement and character references to the judge. The prosecutor recommended the agreed-upon sentence. 18 months house arrest, 3 years probation, $2.3 million in fines and back taxes, the judge announced. Margaret squeezed my hand as we left the courthouse. I could have gone to prison for 20 years. Yes, you could have. Because of you, I'm going home today. That evening, David and I had dinner with Margaret at her house. One of many meals she'd have to eat there during her house arrest. I owe you both an apology, she said as we sat down. Amanda, I've spent years criticizing you for things I didn't understand. Thank you for saying that. I thought being a good wife meant cooking and cleaning and staying home. I didn't realize that supporting your husband could mean building a career that helps people in crisis. David reached for my hand. Mom, Amanda has been supporting our family all along. Her success allowed me to take cases for people who couldn't afford to pay much. Margaret nodded. I see that now. Amanda, I was wrong about everything. You're not useless as a wife, you're extraordinary as a person. 6 months later, Margaret's house arrest ended, and she threw a dinner party to celebrate. But this time she introduced me differently to her friends. This is my daughter-in-law, Amanda. She's one of the top criminal defense attorneys in the state. She saved my life. The irony was perfect. The woman who once called me useless as a wife was now bragging about my professional accomplishments to anyone who would listen. Margaret learned that success comes in many forms, and that judging people by outdated standards says more about the judge than the judged. And I learned that sometimes the people who need our help most are the ones who've treated us worst. But that's what being a professional means, putting personal feelings aside and doing what's right. Even when what's right is saving your mother-in-law from 20 years in federal prison. The